Within the next couple of hours, her symptoms intensified into a high fever, with severe coughing followed by an abnormally heavy nosebleed. Her parents checked on her through the night, but her symptoms didn't improve. They decided they'd give Dr. Porter a call in the morning. Unfortunately, by morning, it was too late. The terrifying signal from the tower. The first time the sickness came to Harmony, Kansas, no one really thought much of it. Harmony was a sleepy town nestled among an endless sea of wheat fields, capped with a vast blue sky. Locals joked that Harmony was the kind of place where the biggest excitement was the annual corn and tractor pull festival. There was a reason that most of the residents had been in Harmony for generations. They liked the slow pace. They liked knowing everyone in town. Harmony was a bit lost in time, but the familiarity offered a sense of comfort to its residents, a refuge from an uncomfortably fast-paced outside world. At first, the monstrosity of a cell tower, newly installed just last summer, had seemed like progress. A faceless telecom company had installed the ugly behemoth just outside of town. In a flat landscape with few trees, the large skeletal tower overshadowed the small town's icons, including their Capitol building with its gold-painted dome and the gleaming white bell tower of the First Baptist Church. Leery of change, some of the older residents had resisted against the tower being built, but Mayor Bud Peterson had insisted that connectivity would put Harmony on the map. It turns out Mayor Bud was correct. Harmony was on the map now, but for a very different reason. The symptoms began subtly enough. Mild headaches, cough, sniffles, and fatigue that people brushed off as the changing season. They were headed into flu season after all. There was a faint sense of unease in the town, as an alarming number of people were now under the weather, but it wasn't really talked about. People clucked their tongues and shook their heads when comparing the number of sick family members, but everyone knew some years were just worse than others when it came to flu season. So while people were a bit worried, no one panicked quite yet, until the nosebleeds started. Marge Callahan, the town's baker, was the first to notice something odd. She'd been rolling out dough for her locally famous cinnamon rolls when her nose started bleeding so profusely she thought she'd somehow cut herself. Feeling a little woozy from the rapid loss of blood, she shakily made her way to a small stool in the back corner. Her assistant Mary came out of the restroom to see her boss deathly pale, swaying on the stool in an attempt to keep her balance. When she realized it was just a nosebleed, she brought Marge a glass of water, assuring her with a comforting pat on the shoulder. "It's probably just stress," Mary smiled, though her hands trembled a bit as she handed her boss tissue after tissue. By the following week, half the town was experiencing similar symptoms. Headaches, coughing, overwhelming fatigue, nosebleeds, and now, there was something darker, vivid, horrifying nightmares. Dreams of strange, shadowy figures watching them, speaking in a language no one could understand but everyone felt in their bones. Through the night, people could hear their family members and neighbors screaming in terror. They would wake up sick with dread and drenched in sweat. Harmony's local doctor, a rather stern middle-aged man named Dr. William Porter, had no answers. Could be a viral outbreak, he mused, though the tests he sent to the state lab came back inconclusive. "It's like nothing I've ever seen," he admitted to Sheriff Jack Monroe one morning as the two of them sat in a booth of the local diner, the lines on his face deeper than ever. "I've spoken with several of my colleagues in both Wichita and Topeka, including an infectious disease specialist, and—" He let his sentence trail off. After a long pause and a couple of deep, fortifying breaths, he finished his thought. They think it feels engineered." Sheriff Monroe sat in stunned silence, his mouth hanging open in shock. He had no idea how to respond to that. Dr. Porter wasn't known for hyperbole, so if he felt this virus, or whatever it was, might be engineered, the sheriff was inclined to give him the benefit of the doubt. Did they need to notify the CDC? He'd spent 20 years on the force dealing with drunk farmers and the occasional runaway teenager. This was way out of his league. Engineered? That sounded like something out of a science fiction movie. Surely they weren't dealing with an engineered virus, not here in small-town USA. He left the diner with a knot of fear mixed with greasy hash brown sitting uncomfortably in his stomach. Several weeks after the townsfolk's symptoms began, a group of bored high schoolers with nothing better to do dared each other to climb the new cell tower. Harmony High didn't have much in the way of entertainment, and the tower, with its blinking red light, beckoned to them like a strange, forbidden landmark. Displaying a bravado they didn't feel, the kids began awkwardly climbing the tower. They slowly made their way up the metal rungs as the blinking red light lured them higher and higher. They had begun their climb as normal, healthy teenagers, but the closer they got to the top, the stranger they started to feel. Their eyes began watering profusely, as a pounding headache took control of their thoughts. Without a word exchanged, and nearly at the top, they started climbing back down in unison. As they descended, their headaches began to intensify, and a sudden deep, rattling cough made it difficult to grasp the freshly painted metal. By the time they reached the ground, two of them nearly passed out. Abby Timmons, one of the quieter students, came home with wild eyes and hands that wouldn't stop shaking. She muttered incoherently about the hum and 5G. Her parents tried to get her to explain, but she wouldn't, or couldn't elaborate. Once she calmed down, she just lay curled up on her bed, pale and unblinking. Within the next couple of hours, her symptoms intensified into a high fever, with severe coughing followed by an abnormally heavy nosebleed. Her parents checked on her through the night, but her symptoms didn't improve. They decided they'd give Dr. Porter a call in the morning. Unfortunately, by morning, it was too late. Her parents found her in her room, laying on her blood-soaked pillow, her eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. She was completely unresponsive. Her final message to them was on her desk, a frantically scrawled sentence written several times. They know about 5G. With no other choice and his small clinic and the local morgue overwhelmed, Dr. Porter called in reinforcements. A team from the CDC arrived, their white vans a stark contrast against the golden wheat fields. They set up a perimeter around the tower and began taking readings. The townsfolk, desperate for answers, gathered at the local diner to speculate. "It's radiation," Marge declared, her cinnamon rolls forgotten, her symptoms slightly subsided. "That tower's frying our brains." "No," said Charlie Grayson, the eccentric old man who'd lived in Harmony longer than anyone. "It's not radiation, it's them." "Them who?" Sheriff Monroe asked politely, sipping his coffee. Charlie leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper, as if sharing a forbidden secret. "I've seen lights in the sky. Bright ones, strange ones. That tower ain't for cell phones, it's a beacon, a signal for—" He trailed off, his eyes darting nervously to the window. "They say it's for that 5G. He leaned back in the faded bench, as if trying to stay out of the sight of anyone that might be looking in the diner's window. The sleep-deprived sheriff shook his head. He was used to Charlie's wild theories on just about everything, but this time unease curled around him, nearly suffocating him. It refused to let go. That night, as he lay awake in bed staring mindlessly at the ceiling, he heard it for the first time. It was the faintest hum, so low it was almost imperceptible. Somehow it came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It burrowed into him, vibrating through his entire body, as if it wanted to wrestle control from him, become part of him. When he finally fell into a fitful sleep, his dreams were filled with shadows and whispers. A dreadful feeling of complete and utter hopelessness enveloped him tightly, like a heavy, dampened blanket. Perhaps the CDC team's presence was meant to be reassuring, but their tight-lipped demeanor only added to the growing paranoia. Dr. Porter managed to corner one of the younger scientists, a pale, nervous woman with a name tag that read, Dr. Reyes. "Off the record," Dr. Porter began, speaking softly as he looked around. "What are we dealing with exactly?" Dr. Reyes hesitated, nervously glancing around as if the walls had ears. After a couple of minutes of silence, she finally whispered, "The tower isn't broadcasting a normal signal, it's something else. It's not just happening here, but you didn't hear that from me. The frequency, it's affecting people's brains. Not everyone, but some." Her voice trailed off. "It seems to target the immune system too, but not with everyone." She shook her head, not wanting to say any more. "And the symptoms, is it contagious?" Dr. Porter was going to get as much information out of her as he possibly could. Dr. Reyes sighed heavily. "It affects people differently. For some it's nasty cold symptoms, for others it's nosebleeds. Some nightmares." Her face darkened, her voice came out in a harsh whisper. "It's like it's unlocking parts of the brain that shouldn't be unlocked. It seems to change people. And yes, it is contagious." By the third week, Harmony was unraveling. Over half of the small town was quite ill, leaving everyone frightened and overwhelmed. Under the extreme stress of the situation, people began turning on one another, angry at each other for any perceived mistake or slight. The town's hospital did not have the staff to handle the sheer volume of ailing citizens, and the morgue had nowhere to store the number of bodies starting to pile up. Standing menacingly over the town, the hated cell tower still emitted its loud hum, the red light at the top blinking ominously. Though questions continued to be asked, no one was able to get any reliable answers. Sheriff Monroe finally decided to confront the CDC team, but when he arrived at their makeshift camp, he found it abandoned. Equipment was scattered about, and all of their vans were gone. He knew from speaking with other law enforcement officers and emergency workers that similar symptoms had been reported in patients in nearby communities. Apparently, Harmony's two closest neighbors were also battling similar situations. Perhaps the CDC was working in neighboring towns. But then, why did they discard their equipment? The pounding headache the overworked sheriff had been fighting all morning became sharper and more intense as he stumbled back to his squad car. Through bleary eyes, he noticed a piece of paper under the windshield wiper of his squad car. Scrawled in hurried, jagged handwriting, it read, "We opened the door. Now we can't close it." By the time the national news finally picked up the story, Harmony was a ghost town. Reporters found abandoned cars, homes left unlocked, and dinner plates still sitting on tables. But no people. The cell tower stood silent and unblinking, its red light pulsing steadily against the twilight sky. At this point, cities and towns across the nation that had similar 5G towers were beginning to suffer the same fate. The most frustrating part was that these cell towers were continuing to be built. In spite of the protests of terrified citizens and overwhelming evidence of the harm they were causing, the towering monstrosities were popping up across the country. But since many large and influential corporations found these towers to be quite lucrative to their bottom line, the carnage was going to continue in the name of progress. The empty town's message to the rest of the nation was shown in clip after clip across news stations. It was a tattered banner hung from a chain-link fence, its washed-out plea now barely visible. "May God help us all."